Jason, welcome back to the World XP podcast. This is episode number 14. You're the first repeat guest, so
that's an honor.
Yeah, so here we are. We're just one of the things that we've been talking about before is there's this documentary series on PBS.
Yeah,
it's called
not free anymore.
Well, we can put a link to where I watched it, some small YouTube channel. We'll put a link to that in the description, but it's called America America During Reconstruction or something like that. Is that correct?
It's like Reconstruction, America's story that hasn't been told. It'll be in the link or in the description.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we were talking about right now, just before we started recording, was how to teach it, and the reason being for that is, at least from my perspective, the history to get the true picture of what really happened during Reconstruction and during the that sort of time, like of slavery, and then leading into where we are now. The history of the Black community is really a nuanced and complicated history in a good way, and so I would say it definitely needs to get taught in schools. I think we definitely agree on that. Mm-hmm. But the question that I had raised to you was how to teach that the standards of today are not the same as the standards that people held themselves to back during the 1860s and 70s from the perspective of a kid. The reason being for that is you always have a kid who's a little bit perceptive and will ask what seems to be a very obvious question to the kid, but in reality have a very complicated answer. So like, you're in a public place and the kid's like, why is that lady fat? Or like something like that, right? Where it's almost like it seems so obvious to the kid. And so in this case, it would be like, why was it okay to kill Black people? Because the world that they live in now, that's not okay, but it's the same country. And to actually really get the answer across, I think, is a little bit more complicated than you would think at first glance, I would say. So yeah, I don't know what so you kind of started to answer, and then we were like, let's just get started because this is good discussion. So we can start from there.
Yeah. So the question we were discussing right before we began recording was, how do you teach the actual true history of the country, especially what happened right after the Civil War with Reconstruction? And it was proposed in the idea of a high school curriculum, but we can tackle both high school and collegiate. But for high school, first and foremost, it kind of would have to be on teachers. It would have to be something the teacher is already aware of. And with our education system today, especially if they're a product of our modern day education system, they just kind of went through high school, went to college, maybe gotten their master's. I think a master's is required now for teaching in high school. They would have to at least be aware of the truth of what happened during Reconstruction, what happened after the Civil War. So it would stem from there first. But let's say, I'll put myself in that position and try and think of, if I was the teacher, how would I formulate that curriculum? First thing I would have to do, and this is something that we talked about with Jenna, was reading, because just the time frame that high school has, reading additional stuff, and since it's the 21st century, providing visual stuff. So today, this documentary would definitely be something that I would recommend students to watch. On top of that, just kind of do their own research, or not do their own research, but provide research that's been done that kind of fully, in text that supports and pretty much validates everything that's been found in a documentary. So if you have any, documents that said this happened, like one of, I think, the things that talks about in the documentary is the only coup d'etat that happened on our soil was, I think, in North Carolina.
Wilmington. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up to you later. That was one of the parts of the documentary that made my blood boil.
So stuff like that, like having actual text evidence of it happened, but what did the people who took control and killed the people who were in power, when they took control and took power, what is it that they said happened? Because it says in the documentary it was a race riot. It was a race riot, and history can tell based on true documentation of what actually happened, that just wasn't the case. But definitely you kind of have to just tell the truth. These questions are really hard, especially for a high schooler. I definitely think it would be tough to talk to some high schoolers about this, but not telling them would do a disservice rather than helping them. Trying to, avoid having that conversation doesn't help anyone, because if you continue to go on and live your life thinking, oh, that could never happen in this country, yet it did, you then have to try and peel back either, decades or years of just knowledge that you've put on top of that and be like, well, this has now shaped the way I see this. This is how shaped the way I see Black people in business or Black people in politics. Well, you have to understand that there's already a history between Black people in politics, Black people trying to just live their life, trying to own land, trying to own business. That's already been gone through during Reconstruction.
Right.
And it'd be difficult, especially for high school, because we've all been through high school, at least at this age.
Yeah. I want to run about something by you real quick, though. And that's from the standpoint of Black History Month as a thing. I almost feel, and you could tell me if I'm way off base, but I feel like that does a disservice to actually teaching it, because if you have this month, so if it were me designing the curriculum, right, you just go chronologically as you would, but you wouldn't have to have this month where you just stop and only talk. Like ideally, you'd have it woven into American history because it's a part of that. And so you'd have I remember, what part of the year did you get to the Civil War?
I don't know. It was over. I think it was over a year or two, or a period.
Yeah, so you'd start with for a U.S. history class, you kind of start with Jamestown, and that's and you'd get to the Revolutionary War-ish at the end of the first quarter. I should probably have asked a teacher before I started saying this, but and then you get to the Civil War, I think around Christmas, or before Christmas, because then the spring is Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II, Cold War. And then SOLs and movies.
Yeah, honestly.
But so I think it would be important to have your history of Reconstruction, because the way that I remember it would be you'd go up to 1877 when the end of Reconstruction was, and then you'd skip to kind of Ellis Island and immigrants, Industrial Revolution, World War I. And that part of what happened between 1877 and sort of 1890, 1895-ish, kind of just doesn't get taught
on purpose. It's intentional.
And so
see from the documentary, there was reasons that a lot of what went on during that time has been kind of pushed under the rug.
Right, 100%. And so that needs to get, I feel like to do that, you almost need to just get rid of that, because I feel I remember thinking back on that February, learning that month was just it felt weird to me. And it was one of those things where, and again, maybe this is me not understanding, but it was almost just why don't we just learn about this in chronological order with the rest of American history? Not because I didn't feel it was bad that it was getting singled out in sort of the, let me search for the right words here. I didn't feel it was getting singled out in a positive way. I didn't feel that month was let's shine a spotlight on this. I felt that month was somebody told you had to do it to for whatever reason, and you're kind of half-assing it because you're here's 4 facts about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, and then you just continue on. It's well, why aren't we learning about that stuff in the time period that they were actually active? And that never made sense to me. Just from a learning perspective, because then you put stuff out of order. And if you're teaching somebody something in chronological order, and then you teach them a bunch of stuff out of order, it separates it in a way that makes it seem like it's not part of what happened. To me anyways. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but there needs
I would say it's a good thing, and almost, I would say a bad thing, but it's a good thing because, without it, would it actually be told the correct way in a sense? So you're saying someone was forced to get to make it the month, so we made it the month.
So my argument is based off the caveat that it would be taught, like it would actually be taught in the timeline correctly. Like if it was taught, I feel like we don't have a need for that.
So you're saying like the standard school from like August to June, August to May school year.
Yeah, if you teach like the correct stuff in the chronological, like if you actually teach the Reconstruction stuff, like is what is in the documentary, and you actually teach what Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois did and Rosa Parks, if you actually teach what they did in their correct time period, then I feel like then there's no need to make it weird almost.
I would have to say if you have a whole year time frame, to make it as thorough as you possibly can get it, a complete understanding and knowledge of the history, you're going to have to break it up. And you're going to have to, and high schoolers don't do this. We talked about this before we started, but they don't, reading is not the number one thing that high schoolers do. You're not going to be able to teach. You can find, compiled videos, compiled documentaries, or just things that you can visually take up a class and kind of cover a whole sector. Like about this could be 4 classes in high school. You get about an hour, 15, hour and a half of classes in high school. This could be 4 days throughout. Yeah. You have now just learned of an entire period.
Yeah.
Is it the full complete story? Probably not. There's probably information that may not ever be dug up just because it's so deeply. But you're getting a pretty thorough and comprehensive understanding of, okay, this is what's common of what happened, even if there isn't documentation of it in a documentary. How you said like how could you think of something like this back in the day when you don't do it now? Well, if you were back in the day, this probably wasn't anything of a surprise because it was probably happening all over the South, all over the country. So getting a full understanding, you're going to have to do additional or supplemental information.
Sure.
But as far as timeline goes, the story of the Black people in this country isn't something that you can, as you said, you can't strap it down to 1 month. And even if it was in chronological order, you would have to continuously, this is the weirdest dichotomy that history and education has created about this country, as if the Black experience or the Black story in America is somehow separated from the story of America.
It's not at all. I don't understand why they did that.
It's intentional. You have got to understand that the entire political.
Let me rephrase. I understand why, but
it's hard to comprehend why, in a sense. For some, it probably isn't hard because, they may either be in a system or a financial class where they just don't really care and they have never had to. But you cannot tell the full, complete story of this country without having the story of the Black person in this country told from the beginning. Literally, I won't say from the beginning, not from 1690, but the moment that slaves were brought to America, the course of this country was changed forever. We then created an entire society, not only governmentally, but financially, socially, built upon the idea that there is now a group of people in this country that you can then abuse for labor and who are second class to you. Therefore, no matter how bad you feel, you can be the poorest of the poor, the farmer, wherever you are, but you will always know that there is a Black person that you can say you are better than simply because you're white. And having that you can't create a society, built upon that without that leaving something in its history, without that leaving some, generational feelings, generational attitudes down the line to where we are today, So I think the question was still how to incorporate it into school. So definitely trying to incorporate it into high school, you're gonna have to do supplemental information. It can't just be, you can have the state create your guidelines, at least here in Virginia from where we are. You can have the state create your guidelines. But you're gonna have, if you're looking for the complete education of the students that you're taking care of, you're gonna have to do extra information and extra legwork to make sure that they go into the next grade or they go out into their lives understanding a thorough and complete understanding of the history. As far as college goes, we're kind of fortunate enough to have the electives. As you said, you took a bunch of electives where you kind of learned a lot of the information. But for some students, like you said, it's an elective. The Gen Ed one, at least in Mary Washington, was the 18. It was like
there were 2. It was like split up. It was like U.S. history to 1865, and then 1865, and then 1865 to present.
Yeah. And to be honest, that, like you said, it kind of, finishes out the Civil War, kind of touches on Reconstruction, and it goes into Industrial Revolution, and then everything else that moves forward.
Yeah.
But for the simple fact that if it's not told in high school, and if the gen ed education isn't telling the full complete story, the elective needs to be centered around what has happened to the Black people in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that is starting to be pushed forward. Mayor Washington probably has been pushed forward before my time there, and now that I'm trying to actually be in that push, I can now see, people are, it's trying to become like a from the ground up thing, and people have been, it's a required necessity at this point, because you're missing out on such a big portion of information and such a big access to, the experience of literally not half, but a good portion of people in this country that their ancestors have experienced in creating the country that everyone is able to benefit from today.
Yeah, I think this is, it's definitely a tough one. I think from the standpoint of how do you get that pushed into, how you get that pushed into education without, I don't want to say without doing anything, but
but see, you're gonna have to do something. That's you're gonna have to like overhaul. The thing about it is, if you want to make it a priority, it's gonna take overhauling.
It's gonna take an overhaul and a generation or two after before people actually understand what happened. Because I think if you went and asked like the average person about, we'll use the documentary as an example again, I think most people would say like, I don't know, I had no idea. Because that period from 1865 to like 1914.
It was like 1898 before like the Jim Crow era kind of kicked in. It was like 1898, 19.
Yeah, but I'm saying that from 1865 to 1914 is glossed over in almost every history class I've taken, except maybe sometimes they talk about the Spanish-American War. And that's it. And that's like 1898. And then they talk about some Ellis Island stuff and like, that's it. So, but even then to make it, it's like, it's just an incomplete telling of history, to be honest. And you need, so I think, I don't know, this is one of the podcasts where we had no plan coming in. We were just going to talk. So, but it's good. So I think that what's interesting about history from the standpoint of history itself, not necessarily what's taught in school, because most of the things that are taught in school, regardless of subject, are incomplete. Anyways, it's like how do you pass the test that gets you to the next grade, and then how do you pass the test that gets you into college, and then that's it. Like, it doesn't actually matter what you learn as long as you can pass the test. Which is just, it's just a like, how our education system has ended up at this place is beyond me, because it's not actually educated. Like, it just teaches you what you need to pass, to like the people that have decided that that's what you need to know to pass the test, like that qualifies you as educated. It's like a very, like, who makes those decisions? And so it's like, I don't know. That's definitely a broader education question, for not just pertaining to Black history, but school in general. And that was kind of like, and that agenda, or just who, because like if you have somebody who got that job just because they know somebody, and they're not qualified anyways, they might not even have an agenda. They might just be bad at their job, and that's not good either. Obviously, but it kind of goes back to like when universities were first founded back in, like, you think about like ancient Rome and stuff. But that's what those were for. It wasn't to pass a test. It was to learn. It was to learn, like, if you were in university in like in Europe or like ancient Rome or Greece, like you were supposed to learn about like the math of the time, or the science of the time, or the history that, like, it was just like, or like philosophy, or like even when like UVA was founded, or William and Mary, or any of those, like Harvard, Cambridge, it was never like you need this test to get in, or you need this standardized. It was like the point was to teach,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've lost a lot of that in this sort of public education system that we're in, because in an effort to standardize everyone, because you need a degree to get a job, and people, right, it makes sense, you want everybody to have access to that higher education, but at the same time then you need to standardize stuff, so somebody from California who wants to come here,
Virginia, yeah.
like the tests are like the same, so and what that does is it lowers the standards of what each, like what you need almost, and it does a disservice, I think.
Yeah, especially for like students who learn different ways. The idea of standardized tests in itself is kind of, someone creates the standard and says either you can pass this bar or not, dictates if you're educated, quote unquote educated or not. And if you can, get 1,400 on your SAT, you can then make it into school because you're that educated enough. In reality, you can have someone who is probably one of the most creative people to walk this earth who cannot pass an SAT, who don't actually even need a formal education, who can go on. And that's one thing about the idea of entrepreneurs, just not you don't in the digital age, especially today, and this kind of advances the topic a little bit. You don't really need a degree unless you're trying to get like a 9-to-5 job. If you have the drive, and this is
or
like,
to become a teacher or professor,
or to become a teacher, because honestly, what do you do when you become a teacher or professor? You assign things to learn.
yeah.
First, most teachers are given, I forget exactly what it's called, but they have like their curriculum that they need to achieve by the end of the year, and have had their way that they can apply that. But at the end of the day, a teacher is supposed to teach you things. A degree doesn't say that you've learned it. That just means you passed the test to say that you've learned it. I mean, even look at schooling today. With a lot of students going back virtually, you can find half of the things online. I forget which website was the biggest like common website in college where you can just find a bunch of answers to like multiple choice quizzes.
Well, like Quizlet and stuff.
Quizlet, yeah, exactly. So like imagine how many students are, going into their either senior year or starting out high school or college, and that's the education that they're getting. Like, I guarantee so many questions are being utilized on Quizlet. And even if they weren't there, they're probably being created so that way students who are coming across those questions can now find it. So you can avoid all of that. Figure out, from A to Z, everything about a specific subject and become way more educated than even the person who may be teaching that subject. Degree without getting any type of formal education.
Yeah, I've done that myself, to be honest. I get in these moods where like I'm super obsessed with like one subject for like a month, and I'll just Google everything and like watch YouTube videos and read articles and do all sorts of stuff. Like I did that with game theory for like 3 weeks, and it's like it's crazy. I had never even heard of it. It just popped up on YouTube one day. And then the same thing with this documentary about Black history. It's like, let me just binge watch all of these episodes and Google a bunch of other stuff. And like some of the people's names that were in there that I hadn't heard before, I went and Googled them, see like what they did and like in their life and stuff. And I feel like I've learned more practical things anyways than when I did in high school. And I don't know, man, it's weird. It's like, it also takes a certain type of maturity, I think, as well. Like when I was in high school or middle school, probably more high school, it's like, I didn't want to learn. I didn't want to be there. But now that like, when I can learn on my own, I'm curious naturally. And so I'll go teach myself like, how do stocks work? Right? Like how do, I don't know, like I went and read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, where he lays out basically, it's like 3 chapters when I'm on the second one. And the first one, he talks about basically like, you can break down the influence on a person to like government influence, individual responsibility, and societal influence. And you can pretty much break it down into those 3 things. And then what is the optimal balance for those 3. And then one of the chapters is like the importance of free speech. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, about like who decides what makes you educated. It's like, well, who decides what
free speech,
like what free speech is? And that's the argument for why you should touch it as little as possible, because eventually somebody's going to come along where and change it. And so the idea would be that in the society, like the societal marketplace will regulate speech. It's like you and I both know there's things that we can't say, but it's not outlawed that we can't say those things. It's like
It's
taboo.
society.
It's society. And that's how it's like for something like that, you want the societal influence to be the number one influence on that sort of thing, rather than it be written into law. Because times change, as we've seen through with American history, right? 100 years ago, it was totally acceptable to like do horrible things to black people because they were black, and now it is not. Well, less so. But a lot of that, even though it's written into law, right? 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, you need that societal influence to come along with it. And so I'm kind of rambling at this point, but
what do you have? All right. So when you talk about like society having the influence over, kind of what's appropriate, what is allowed in a sense. And I guess bringing it back to the topic of this discussion that we were having, the idea that a lot of the stuff was societally allowed has some truth, and also has some who took the reins of control and who was in control and who was there to enforce what the law had said. So this kind of goes back to both the coup that we had talked about in Wilmington, as well as the KKK trials that went on later on. I forget which year. I think that was in like the early 1900s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so as well.
But the fact that you can say, society can bring up all of these issues. The people that you talk to can bring up all of these issues. Point to, have factual evidence. This person did that at this time, at this location. It all depends on who's in power to then enforce the law that says that whatever was done shouldn't be done. Ooh, excuse me. Like back then, the idea that you could, in a sense, it was illegal. Murder is illegal, period. Those who enforce whether murder is illegal or not were probably the same people who were getting involved in the violent acts against black people.
Right.
So not necessarily that society was saying they could, but the fact that society says you shouldn't, but there's people who in power who don't care what society says. That's where there's laws on the books that say.
Yeah. So it's kind of like the legal side of it is like not allowed, but you need to have all three of those things. So from an individual responsibility standpoint, they were like, yeah, that's okay. We can do that. They were in power at that time. So even though the law on the books, like the legislation said you couldn't do it, two of the three didn't agree. And so that's why it was deemed okay. But I think what I was trying to get at was it depends on what the thing is for what the optimal balance should be. So like for free speech is like government should be least involved, and it needs to be individual responsibility in society. And so for something like lynching or killing of a black person back in that time, you would need way more government influence like you did during Reconstruction when they had the military governors and the federal troops down there and preventing those sort of things from, or at least trying to prevent those sort of things from happening from 1865 to 1877. So I think where I was going to go with that was education. I'm not sure what the optimal balance of that is, because I think, as we've discussed, it's like who decides whether or not you're educated. I think we can probably agree that there needs to be some sort of government influence, but I think probably not a lot. And then where's the rest of that responsibility fall? Well, is it society or is it individual? And I'm not really sure the answer to that, because different people learn in different ways.
Yeah. So you can't really have society say what the best way to learn or what dictates someone who has learned enough information.
Right.
Let's say 9 people learn based on reading and 1 learns based on visual or hearing. 9 people in society are saying, hey, you can't learn this way. You're not qualified.
And often you don't know either. Like when you're a kid, you don't know.
Yeah. Especially like we were talking about in high school. Like it's hard to especially trying to teach these type of discussions to people at that young of an age. Is like, they don't even know fully themselves yet exactly how they want to learn, tough information or information at all.
And if you learn by talking, like I learn a lot by talking, like by having these conversations, like with you, I learn a ton. But how many discussion-based classes did you have in high school? I think probably maybe one or two, if that. And then in college, it would be a little bit more. But the thing with that is they would say, okay, well, you need to read this thing, and we're going to only talk about this thing, this one thing. And so it doesn't allow for, to me anyways, exploration of different like thoughts or ideas. Like you and I, we would never have a chance in a classroom setting to go have this conversation and learn, because it's just not set up for that. And so you would say, okay, well, maybe the responsibility lies on the individual. But you can't really say that either, because when you're a high schooler or younger, it's like you don't know. You're not like you don't even know what you're going to eat for breakfast that day. How are you going to say, I know that I'm going to learn about this thing? It's like you don't know that. So it's a weird one, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and society trying to create it is, it's not a good, because then it can always be influenced pretty much. And the idea of, how you said, government should always kind of have a play in it. One of the things they talked about in the documentary was, I forget which textbook company it was, but they had put labels on certain textbooks that had been unjust to the South. Granted, that was kind of like a societal group.
Was it the Daughters of the Confederacy or whatever?
Yeah. But they had ties simply to the government because they were their name, the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
So having that, and then having that kind of play in hand with financial groups and textbooks, kind of it has overreaching, like
it does.
Hand in there where it doesn't need to be.
I think it'll be a generational thing with Black history, at least. I think if you look at another generation or two down the line, I think, hopefully, knock on wood, we will end up with a more, I hate using the term educated, not because it's like a bad thing, but educated based on our government's definition of educated is, I don't, just makes me feel like icky. I like, I guess a more learned society as a whole. So, but you can, no worries, but you can educate people with false information, and then you can say they're educated, and that does no one any good except for whoever wants those ideas to be out there. Yeah, I don't know. One thing though, the Daughters of the Confederacy thing with the statues, we talked about that in the first podcast that we did. And I don't think I've changed my stance all that much from the standpoint of like the statues that they put up, like Stonewall Jackson statues and things of that nature. I agree still that they should be taken down. They have no place here. But and now that the slave block is gone, like I'm not like, oh, you should put it back. But like on the same token, it's like in the education spectrum of individual versus societal responsibility of like to actually know what's on there. It's like that's one that wasn't part of that Daughters of the Confederacy like political message type deal. And so I'm not sure. It's one of those things where I think people need to be a little bit more careful maybe with what the history is behind that thing, whether it's the slave block or something else. And probably I think where we had a misunderstanding was my concern was not necessarily with taking the statue down, is making sure that we take the right ones down, I guess, if that makes sense. And like to not be hasty before doing it. And obviously I think that's probably comes from, I think that was maybe the misunderstanding. I don't know.
I would say, I guess it was kind of yes and kind of no. When I try and think about anything regarding to the Civil War, slavery, I take the perspective Germany takes with it, where they don't build statues of Hitler or anyone from his Reich because it was wrong. It was atrocious of what was done, regardless of, it's slightly different with him because he made an international scene. America kind of kept his dirt here, statewide or nationwide, I guess. Extent it didn't intrude on anybody else. So the fact that we've been arguing amongst ourselves over what we need to do with our own history, rather than have the entire world kind of looking at us like shaming us in a sense, I don't expect other countries to know everything that went on with regarding to slavery and regarding to trying to restore the rights of Black people in the country. Everyone knows about the Nazis. Everyone knows what kind of went on during World War II. So for them, they kind of have zero room to try and build statues or any type of memorabilia for what happened under Hitler. They just teach the people. They the generations going forward. They tell you, hey, this is what happened, probably in more detail than we get here in America.
I would think, yeah.
Trying to understand what went on societally. What did that even look like? Like imagine if the same thing they said happened at, the first 3 years or 4 years before he kicked things off looked like what's going on in our country now. You never know. But in terms of that perspective, bringing it here, if we were to be taught and understood, or even just kind of, as you said, pique our own curiosity into what it is we see, rather than just have to see a monument or see a slave block and just say, oh, cool, and then keep moving. Because I guarantee not everyone who sees any of these monuments, any of these items that are just placed here as kind of reminders to try and teach people, care to look it up. Or if they don't, they just Google it, see what it is, see who the person was, and go on about their business. And they have no clue about what the backstory is. But if they already knew who it was, they wouldn't have to see the statue to be reminded. Like I'm gonna take for instance in Richmond, and that's kind of tricky because that was the capital of the Confederacy, though. So I guess they have a stake on that, but
no, they still don't. That one should have got. That was the Stonewall Jackson one, wasn't it?
It's the Robert. Now I'm talking about the Robert E. Lee one, the one in Monument Square.
The big one.
Yeah, it's huge. I went down there. It is massive.
That one needs to go too, because and so
the idea of the Confederacy itself, and this is I did a talk with the group out here in Culpeper about that, and it is so confusing because if you were to find a group today that really tried and wanted to go to war with and went to war with the established government today, they would be considered traitors. It would be treason. And not only that, you probably would get capital punishment simply for trying to, create your own coup against the country itself. Yet the idea of the Confederacy having to so hate the idea of losing the institution of slavery, the financial, social, society, whatever you want to call it, the institution of slavery itself, they picked up arms against this country, against the nation of America. Confuses me why people are still fantasizing and fetishing the idea of the Confederate itself.
I don't know. I don't get it either, to be honest.
When you look in terms of a war and a battle, you lost. No one's like, bro, go Nazis because they lost the war. No one is trying to pick up. Well, actually, that's a lot because you see in Charlottesville, people are still kind of in that way. But you trying to get on board with a losing side in a sense in a war confuses me when this is still the country you're in.
So that's one of the things the documentary talked about. I know you said you hadn't watched it in a while, but one of the things they talked about was when they went home, the Confederates anyways, they didn't teach that they lost because their cause was unjust. They taught that they lost just because the Union had more stuff, more troops, bigger guns, right? They were like, our cause is still good. Like they called it like the lost cause, and then they had like plays about it and stuff, and then they talked about it in Birth of a Nation, which is actually something I remember learning about in school. Again, I don't remember which class it was, but I do remember learning about Birth of a Nation with I think Woodrow Wilson played it at the White House. But we didn't learn the contents of it. We learned that it was like the first big like cinema masterpiece, right? We didn't learn what it was actually about, which the documentary goes and describes. But they talk about it as like this lost noble cause that they just lost because they had less people. And it's like when
created a whole manifesto. Literally the dude, I forgot what his name was, but he was a writer out of Richmond. and he created, it's literally just called The Lost Cause. It's written by the gentleman, but it's literally, it's essentially a manifesto of what the Confederate South was, what they believed in, and why they fought for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I forgot who I was talking to recently, but I was talking with someone about that idea, that, and it turned, like, one of the words, like the specific language from the documentary does talk about fantasizing about what a country would look like if the South had won. And the idea of the Confederacy really didn't blow up. Like, being a Confederate back in that day was not something popular. No one ran out, picked up their arms, was like, let me go fight for the Confederacy. People really didn't want to have to go to war with their own country over this. So the idea that it picked up steam and people kind of fantasized about what it could have been generations later, it doesn't make sense, for one, on that end. And two, the idea that you could fantasize about, one, a society that didn't happen, but a society in which you as a white person could then subject a black person, and then you can continue to have slaves up into the modern era, and continue to see someone as a second-class citizen societally, and it be okay. Like, the simple idea, and a lot of people don't understand that that's what the Confederacy kind of fought for. That's what they say, it's all about heritage, and then that's what the heritage believed in. That's what they fought for.
Yeah.
So for people to kind of pick it up today and kind of say, man, they want to fly the flag, or they want to wear the rebel stuff. And it's like, you are physically telling me by what you're wearing that you see me that you would like to have seen me as your slave, or like to have seen me as a second-class citizen. Even if you don't know what it means, it's better to educate yourself on what it is rather than fly it saying it's based on heritage. So if you understood what the heritage was, you wouldn't, unless you did believe it. Go ahead.
So two-ish things on that. The first one, when you said like generations later, and you don't understand how it like started becoming fantasized about, is because they didn't teach, like, that generation wasn't taught what actually happened. They were taught the romanticized version of what it was, like, being like, the documentary talked about how the daughters of the Confederacy started because they wanted, like, their dream of being like Southern belles and stuff was over.
Yeah.
And so that's why they didn't understand, like, they didn't get taught what it actually was. And so that's how it sort of created into, is weird. Reconstruction from those 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, were good. But what happened was the education didn't follow. And so it's almost like those 12 years were just erased.
Short-term laws.
To a certain extent. And so that's, to me, how it was fantasized about anyways. And the second point about people today weren't like flying Confederate flag on their truck or whatever, that goes back to whose responsibility is it to get educated and why? Because if they don't know, so for me, which is different than your perspective on this, but from my perspective on this, I'm just like, you're just ignorant. Like, if you're wearing that, like, you don't understand what it stands for, truly. Whereas for you, it hits a little bit closer to home. And so it's like, do we fault the person for really having no idea of what it stands for? And if so, why? Because is it their responsibility to get educated, or is it somebody else's responsibility to tell them what it is?
That's a good question. I personally, and this, I guess my perspective is accountability. I would say it's their responsibility.
I agree.
Like, let's say you put on a soccer jersey. I forget which team it was. There was actually discussion about this, but it was a soccer team that openly said that they did not want any Jewish or Muslim people on the team. I think it might have been Jewish or Muslim.
Was it recently?
Nah, this might have been.
Oh, I was about to say.
But it was like the fact that the team was open. I think it's Muslim. I think they were a Christian or Jewish team that did not accept Muslims. So to think that let's say it's 2020. And I buy a jersey with like their star player who may have said the most outrageously, I don't even know what type of prejudice that would be against a religion, but like anti-Islamic, phrase, and they're open and quoted for saying this. And I've got the jersey on, and I'm speaking to someone who's of Islam faith. It would be problematic because they are aware of who the guy, especially if they're a soccer fan, they're aware of who this guy was, what the team believed in. in all of this. And my only reason was for flying it was like, dude, my granddad used to be a fan of this, so I'm a fan of it. You don't know what you're wearing. Like, you're like, if you're gonna wear it, at least be conscious of what the team was and what they played for or fought for. I mean, that's simple fact. You don't put on a Redskins jersey just because you have no clue who the Redskins are. You know, just because you like the team logo. I mean, granted, there are some people, I'm saying this, and the reality is there are some people who do just do it like that.
So I was going to say, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But have you ever just looked at a shirt or a jersey in a store and been like, oh, that looks dope, I'm gonna get it, without looking anything up? I
only have like 2 jerseys.
I know, but for other people, like,
who are like big sports fans,
I'm going to pick on Sammy and Izzy right now.
Yeah, they got buku jerseys.
Because they have so many jerseys of like third kits of soccer teams that like Nike puts a really cool spin on them or whatever. And they're like, oh, that looks cool, I'm just going to get it. And I'm like, hey, who plays for that team? They're like, I don't know. It's like, so should they look it up if they're going to do that? Yeah, I agree. Do they?
Is the question.
Is a different question. And then if they don't, so we still say that, okay, it's their responsibility to know that information because they are sporting the attire or logo or regalia of whatever that thing is. But then what is the consequence for that? And that's where it shouldn't be, in my opinion anyways, it shouldn't be a legal consequence, but rather a societal consequence of saying, hey, don't wear that because it stands for such and such. Like, I don't think that, and that's going back to those 3 things, where's the balance of that? I think that's another one of those things that the government should kind of stay out of, because it's like, who decides what you can and can't wear? It shouldn't be somebody writes this on a piece of paper, like, you can't wear blank. Like, that's, to me, long-term, for the long-term success of a country or a stable society, that's not a good look, to me anyways.
Because power can switch hands, and I mean, look, the discussion that we have today about the Supreme Court justices, you know, Democrats lowered the votes you need to confirm 1 to 51. You lose power, and now the other side can then just pump it as many judges as they want. And now the argument is, if the current justice gets confirmed, will you just up the numbers? Okay, well, 10 years down the line, let's say you lose the majority again, and then they just pump the court because 3 or 4 of them have now passed away.
Right.
It's I don't need that. That's, yeah.
And so that for me is why you leaving that sort of stuff alone and just letting time pass as it does, and letting, like, that sort of stuff, like letting society, as far as what's taboo and what's not, and then what with the Supreme Court, like, the founders wrote it that way for a reason. It's like, you don't just go change it because you are now in power or somebody's not in power, or you want to like speed this nomination through. It's like, it was done that way for a reason. And to mess with it from a power perspective, to me, again, like, moving forward, like, for the long term, like, health and success of the country, is not a good look. It's like absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Absolutely, yep.
And so to let the people in charge, the government, have the least amount of power to decide how you and I can live our lives moving forward is, to me, the optimal way to go. Obviously, they need some power to do certain things, right? Like build roads and fire departments and police departments and like military for protection and things of that nature. But as far as telling, like, you and I what we can and can't wear or say, what, to me, that's none of their concern. That's up to the individual to educate themselves on it, and if they don't, up to their surrounding circle of friends or society to say, hey, don't do that because of XYZ reasons. And so the reason, I think, when we get into super long term discussions, or like super long discussions about like what should be done about this and that, I think that might also be, I would say, for example, hey, who cares if they wear that? And you would say like, well, they shouldn't wear it because of XYZ. And I'm like, I agree, but I don't think the government can tell them to not wear it.
Exactly. Especially in a free democracy as America. And I think the fact that our country as a democracy in itself kind of plays a role in a lot of some of the societal things that we have wrong, because you're going to have people who are not alike. It's not a strict controlled regime.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend who's visited China before. And when you try and you can't speak any dissent against the Chinese government. For one, they have incredible surveillance. So if you're seen on video or you're heard if you're an important person and you're heard saying it, there's going to be repercussions. So there is no dissent against the Chinese government when you're there. So they can do whatever they want. There's no problem. The citizens aren't going to say anything. But for here in America, if the government does things that the people don't like, it becomes an issue. Look at the issues of race today. Look at the issue of climate change. When the government is in control and they are just doing what they think either, benefits them more than likely, because there is no benefit to the people they represent, honestly, with a lot of decisions and stuff that they pass. Mm-hmm. So then they say, this is what people want. This is good for the country. But like 3/4 of the country or 2/3 of the country is like, no, we don't want this. This is harming us. But then the people in control continue to do that. It looks as if the system is messed up. It looks like it is at that point.
It is. But so that's why they need the power. Like, we need to start peeling back how much power they have. Because right now they're not accountable to the people, which is who they're supposed to be accountable for or accountable to. Because we elect them to do, so like, this is how it looks to me anyways, for why they set it up the way they did. It's like, because you wouldn't want in like a pure democracy, when you can have like pure majority rules. Like, you and I both know that if it was pure democracy, you have a bunch of people voting on stuff that they have no idea anything about, and that wouldn't be good either. And so the idea was that you would have
representatives,
qualified people that you can say that are supposed to act in the best interests of you, and you elect them to do that because you agree with what they stand for or whatever. And then if you don't like what they do, then you vote them out and you vote somebody else in. That, and also it's like you're serving your constituents. So now that that's not happening, that's broken, one. But two, the other thing that I think gets lost on a lot of people is I feel like it was set up in a way, the architecture of the government and like checks and balances and stuff was to protect the rights of someone, of us as people, to say and do kind of what we want, and to let society do the like the third branch, like the third individual society government. Let society and the individual take the responsibility, because they knew that having government control those things isn't a good idea, because to legislate something, you have to define it. And then to define it, well, who gets to define that thing?
Who gets to define it? Whoever's in power, whoever's in majority.
Right, and that's not what you want. So we weren't set up to be some perfect, harmonious like society. We were set up to be able to be free, essentially. And well, that didn't work out for like Black people in the beginning. Obviously, that's kind of what it was set up to do. And so now, once you get into like the issues that we have, like that we were just talking about you're wearing a Confederate, or somebody's wearing a Confederate flag, it's like, that's why for me, I'm like, they should be allowed to do that by law, but morally it's not a good idea. And so like we were talking about the first time, it's like, not all laws are moral, and not all morals are laws, and that's the reason why I think anyways.
You make a good point, and I guess that kind of goes back to the idea of what America is intended to be. Like, in some countries, you think about, well, I won't say that, but again, going back to the China thing, let's say they were in the shoes of Germany. You couldn't go out and just wear some swastika. The government would then it would act. So in America, you're free to do that, Will it look bad for you societally in your community trying to get a job? Yeah. But the law can't say you can't go and do that. You have to use your own judgment, even outside of morals, just outside of what the real world repercussions are going to be. The government can do this. Job might not hire you. Your friends probably won't talk to you no more. You might, like, these things will happen, and that's been delegated to the people of, we kind of decide what is societally right and leave it up to us.
Right. I think that's how it should be. I don't. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of what America was supposed to be, like this, there's not been another society created the way America was created, like the idea of what America was supposed to be, like the whole journey of what it was. Like there's a 95 thesis, I think it is. Not the 95 thesis. I have to think about what it is.
Who wrote it? You know?
I'm not sure. I have to do some Googling because I know there's a 95 thesis by Martin Luther, and then there's I want to say it's Patrick Henry.
Federalist Papers?
Federalist Papers, yes.
Yeah, that was Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, so reading those is like getting what they wanted the country to try.
Did you read them?
Not yet, no. I heard there's PDF versions. I need to print them out.
I read them because...
Are they good?
So, backstory, when I was in high school, it was on the summer reading list. It was like a bunch of novels and stuff. And then the Federalist Papers were at the bottom. And like we were talking about earlier, I was a history nerd. So I was like, I'll read those. There's like, I'm going to get the number wrong and somebody's going to, at least a couple hundred. And I got through like...
Really, it's a book. It's a book at that point. Understand? See it?
Oh, yeah. The book I had was like this thick.
Yeah.
I got through like the first 60 of them.
It was too
and
much.
I was 16 years old and I was like...
Yeah,
but then I went back though.
That young too.
Yeah, I went back and read some of the other ones later, but like they talk about the institution of slavery in there, and they have a really odd view of it. I know we've talked about it before, but it's like one of the things that stuck out to me was, and obviously some of the founding fathers still owned slaves and were racist and the rest, but some were like, I don't know what to do about slavery. I don't like it, but if I release my slaves now, or free them, I worry what will happen to them, as in, like, they didn't want to free them all and then have them go get killed somewhere, or...
Which still ended up happening.
Right, which ended up happening anyways, but at the same point, it's like they were still conscious of the fact that, like, somehow this needs to end in some way. And, like, they were worried back then, I forgot who it was. Somebody wrote that, I think the line was something of like, I'm fearful that this won't get ended without a civil war or something like that. And they said it back in like, they knew, man. It's like, it's really wacky that, because they're our age when they're writing all this stuff, you know, it's wacky that they knew, but
they probably saw society. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, and that's one thing it is incredibly difficult to really understand this country's history unless you do digging like that.
You have to,
because if you want to know, if you go down that journey of, like there's the ideas of conspiracy theories today of going down the rabbit hole. You really want to know the truth, go down the rabbit hole of this country's history. Go back to the people who wanted it. What did they want it to look like? What did they, and specifically how you're saying, what did they think about the institution of slavery? What did people think about how Reconstruction went across? Like there's a rabbit hole I think should be supported.
Like they were writing in like, so the Federalist Papers were written, I think the Constitution was ratified in 87, I think, or 89, I think 1789. And so they're writing these papers while it's getting written. So in the 1780s, late 1780s, early 1790s, they're saying, some of the founding fathers are saying, society is not ready to have all the slaves be released. It's going to take a war to release it. And they said it 80 years in advance. Like they knew. And it's one of those things where, like, if you're sitting there back then and you're like, I really don't like slavery, but I can't really do anything about it because society as a whole isn't there yet. It's like, So
What
like,
you do?
yeah. So like, it's hard. It's hard to like lay, like, I don't know, because everybody is their own person, right? They have their own thoughts and opinions on different things, and they have their own idea of what they want the country to look like. And so like when you and I sit here and talk, and I'm like, I think it's going to still take another generation or two to get to where like you really want to go,
Mm.
and well, and both of us obviously, where both of us really want to go. It's like, well, why is that? Why can't that guy who's wearing a Confederate flag just like realize that that stands for what it stands for? It's like, well, because people are people, and at the end of the day, they either will or won't take the responsibility for it.
Mm.
And most of the time, like John Mulaney was like, it's so much easier to not do anything than to do something.
Yeah.
It's like, and so it's like most people will just not do it.
Mm.
And so it's going to take time. It's like you can't and so going back to me saying that I would rather have society and the individual but have the responsibility of the education and not the government.
Mm.
That's why I'm like, we cannot legislate these things now. Like you can't write that into law, because it's then you have to say, okay, well, who defines what that person needs to know to consider themselves educated or whatever. And then if you don't do that, you can't make people do it without societal pressure. And I don't think we'll get the societal pressure that is necessary to make people do that for another couple of generations. Because right now the pressure that we see is like the woke movement, and then you have people on one side like the savior types that we were talking about before, which is to me just like mind-blowing in its own way. And like, so on the other side, then you have resistance to it, because they see these savior types as like horrible people too. And so then it's just like clashing. And so you can't write it into law to say, hey, one side has to get educated or think in this way, because of kind of like what we talked about earlier. And so then it's gonna like, it's just like, I feel like it's one of those things that's just, it's gonna take time. And I think we're making progress now, definitely, but to write it into law is just like, to me, it's like, that's where I draw the line of like, nope, no, not a good idea. And so like when we were talking before about, oh, that's how we started the conversation when Trump said he didn't want to do those like mandatory like diversity trainings. That was why I drew the line there.
I'm still in my boat on that, just because that isn't necessarily something that forces people to do something that isn't. So actually, rather, how come you think? So I can kind of figure out where I am, because me is just kind of, as a Black person, yes, we all need to learn about this. So I think I would benefit from understanding your perspective. Why not?
So I think let's start with, do you want to say what you think that I think, and then I can tell you where you're wrong?
I'll try.
Go for it.
So from your perspective, is it more or less? Well, see, you're kind of not in the group that I would consider people who would struggle with going to a diversity training. But from my perspective, there are people who do not want to be convicted by what they may learn, specifically either implicit bias or just understanding that if you go through an implicit bias test or understand diversity training, they may feel offended, they may feel attacked because they do some of the things that they say someone of prejudice does. The fact that Trump of all people is the one who took it out of law, who took the requirement away, is he would benefit the most from having it. Granted, he probably would not stick through one because everything they say might be about him. He would be the one to benefit the most from it. So from my perspective is, he's trying to, in a sense, save or assist the people who would be, I wouldn't even say ridiculed, literally be convicted. Like what's being said, they would be the ones that's being talked about. And people see that as always a bad thing. It's, I don't want, they're talking about me. I don't want to feel as if I'm being attacked by someone who thinks they know it all or something like that.
That's why you think that I think that it's a bad idea?
Yes.
So I would say,
for you, it's for the perspective of someone else. But go ahead.
Sure. So I would say that I don't care whether or not people are offended by what they're learning there. I don't think it it has nothing to do with the material of what's there. Although I will say some of the stuff, like I saw one video on Twitter where this lady was in like doing this training, and she literally stands up and she's like, all white people are racist, and they're just sitting there. It's like, maybe, but like also, like, how are you just gonna, like, on what grounds? But so if it's material like that, then I have an issue with the material, but that's a different sort of discussion. So I would say it has less to do with the material and less to do with the people that are actually attending these trainings, and more to do with the fact that it's like once the first one starts, and I know people say this, a version of this sort of argument, it gets thrown out there, kind of like with taxes. People are like, oh, the government's stealing your money, the government's involved, the government's this, government's that. So it kind of is like that, but it's a little, there's like a little tweak on it. And so I would say it's the fact that once the government says that you have to, it's like imposing a thought onto an individual. And ideally what you'd have in that situation is you'd weed out the people who actually think those things based on conversations, and like, you know, that this person is in the hiring process, and like you figure it out, and then you don't have to, like, you just don't even hire them, right? And then they have to change in order to get hired.
What do you mean?
Like, if I know that such and such person is racist and nobody's going to hire them to get a job, they have to figure it out. And that's like societal influence that you would want to make that change, rather than like a mandatory training from a government legislated body saying you have to think this way. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. My issue with that is I don't think it's there. For one, the people already hired. It's for government. It's for federal and state government staff. So if you worked for any department, like of health or Department of Labor, you would go through these trainings. Two, it's not. The thing about diversity training is it's not going to change the way you think. Period. Like, the idea that you going through this training is going to challenge the way you think. It's not. It happens. I mean,
well, then what's the point of doing it?
I mean, because there are some people who benefit from it at the end of the day. The thing about it is, this is something that we talked about through the Multicultural Center, was if you put on a training event, or if you put on any type of roundtable discussion and you don't help, and if no one gets it but one person, you've done your job. If no one leaves the room, if only one person leaves the room saying, you know what, I never saw these things that way, I'm glad I came to this, you've done your job. If out of 100 people, that one person is the only one who says, thank you for putting this on, I did not see these things, you've opened my eyes to a new perspective of things I didn't even realize, it's mission complete. Because that one person can then go on to help more people. The idea of diversity training is simply there to try and assist people in understanding that their own implicit bias may then hinder their ability to have good relationships, actually try and assist people the correct way. It could even help in corporate business. Your implicit bias may lose you a deal. You may say a microaggression to someone who's trying to work with you as a client that offends them. You don't even know you've offended them. And then they say, you know what, I think I'm gonna take my business somewhere else. It only helps people to learn the information. If it's good diversity training, that's the caveat. You said whether or not what the quality of it.
So I agree. My issue is not with, like, if somebody wants to come do diversity training at my company, like, I'm not gonna be like, no. If it is in law that you have to do it, that's where it's like, because right now, why is it being done? It's being done to protect against lawsuits.
I don't think it is.
You don't think so?
No.
Why?
Now, you talking in terms of your company or in terms of the federal government?
If a company did it, it would be to protect against a lawsuit. And so maybe
think about it is the idea of business it's beyond just like immediate. businesses are international. They're multicultural. You may go to China and have to speak with someone over there. Getting diversity training just expands your knowledge about what it means to be in someone else's shoes, period. I can't tell you what it means to be in a Hispanic person's shoes, about saying, trying to say hola instead of hello when you're speaking to a Spanish person. As soon as you see their Spanish, you assume that they know Spanish, so you say hola. Mm-hmm. That's very, very offensive to someone. Do I see it that way? No. Do I say it? I've been caught saying it myself, yes, to certain people, only if they've said it to me or if I know they speak Spanish fluently. But if you go into a conversation like that, or if you get introduced to another Spanish person, or let's say I introduce you to someone who's Spanish, and I say he's from, Dominican Republic, and you say, oh, cool, I visited there, da, 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 da. And then you say something that's, culturally appropriated, or you assume that he can speak this, or you assume he likes something like this, that could then immediately skew the relationship off the jump. Your first impression is now, it's not on a good footing. And my idea for putting this in a corporate setting is simply, that person may be let's say you're an investment company and you're seeking to try and get this brand sold to this one company, and that person is the person you're being from the company. You doing anything like that can then blow the entire deal. You don't work. I don't think you work in marketing or sales like that. But for portions of the company in that area, that can be the number one thing that makes a better salesman or a better marketing person from someone who isn't. If I've been quote unquote diversity trained, because like I said, the quality of your diversity training does matter. But let's say you've been to plenty of diversity trainings across a broad spectrum of different cultures versus someone who's been in the game for 10 years in South Carolina, who's worked with the same company and only spoke with people he's going to have trouble trying to speak with people who live in Pakistan, or someone who works in Vietnam, because they don't understand what it means to talk to someone from that region.
I agree. And so,
and the issue, like you said, is only when you're forced to do it.
That's the problem. I'm good. If you're going to come tell me hey man, you should be respectful of this, and you should probably know that this person, this is a thing in this culture, or whatever, I'm good with it. Right. It doesn't have to do with it doesn't have to do with what it is. It's once you put it into law, it's okay, fine. Who defines what good diversity training is? Mm. Do you have to write on, take a little quiz to say that you are now a diverse, minded individual? Where does that go? And so people, and one of the things is even with you, you're trying to convince me that it's a good thing. And I'm not. I agree with you. It's
and the issue is being forced to go through the training. That's
right. That's the thing.
I guess my counter question to you would be, so if this was something that the owner of a company mandated and made it required, because it's the private sector and it's his company, and would you be cool with that?
Yeah, because it's his company. He can do whatever he wants.
So.
And you choose, because I can leave. I can say I don't want to work here anymore.
You can. If the thing about it is, the thing about the training in Trump's law was it's only for federal and state employees. So technically, you could quit. You can leave that state or federal department. You don't have to stay. You get what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, if that's the case, then it's fine, right? But it's as soon as that goes, and then it's now everyone ever has to do it.
Think about it. You can look at something here in Virginia. So on July 1st, state agencies can no longer test for THC on drug and on screenings for jobs. The sector does not have to abide by that whatsoever.
Right.
If I go and apply to a state job down in Richmond, they can't necessarily test me, or excuse me, not for marijuana. Excuse me. I think it's the felony box. State departments and state agencies, whatever you want to call them, they can't ask that on a federal application. Private companies still can. So regardless of what the state did, the state can create all of these mandates and all of these systems for state jobs because that is the domain that they own. The reason the private sector, and that's the way this country was set up, the reason the private sector is they only have to abide by regulatory laws. That wasn't a regulatory law that was put in place. That was specifically for the construct of the Federalist.
Maybe that's my misunderstanding then. What I read was that it was put in place for that with the intention of becoming regulatory law.
Because think about it, you can't regulate it. Like a private company they can say they do it, but a diversity training may just be a PowerPoint or a TED Talk. At the end, it all depends on what the company sees as necessary. So internationally, globally minded, sales or investing company, they may put, $250,000 into diversity training so that way their people are actually trained in it, versus someone who really only deals with people who live in their state or within their, let's say the East Coast.
Yeah.
They need to spend that much money on diversity. Everyone's pretty much the same in America.
Facts. I feel so. That was my misunderstanding then. But even so, the point. So like, if they want to like to make it mandatory for federal employees only, then like it's fine. If they want to do that, that's fine. But the point, the principle though of what I was saying still stands as far as legislating that sort of thing.
You're using people's perspective on what is and what isn't good.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
that makes sense.
It needs to be like a collective, like all of us think this is not good. Just like one person decided that it wasn't good and then wrote it down and now everybody has to do it. It's like not the, I don't know. This like when I reading the Federalist Papers and reading the writings and like going through history and that sort of stuff, like in the way that I do, the more and more that I read, the more and more I would rather have the government have as little control as possible over my life, to be honest. But I don't know. So, but yeah, diversity training as a whole, like like we were saying, as long as it's done correctly, it's like definitely people could benefit from that, because the true, I'll say, diversity training really only comes with exposure to other people. Like you have to spend time with those people and learn, because even if it's like some guy coming in and saying like, hey, people from this culture don't like this, and then you go like ask them and they're like, where did he get that? like to really have that happen, it only comes from being exposed to people of those cultures and actually learning and talking to them, saying like, hey, like sometimes people make mistakes, right? Like I'll talk to somebody and I'll say something and I had no idea, but like then assuming you're friends with that person, you've already built a relationship and and they know that you didn't mean it in the way that it is in their culture. They'll be like, hey man, next time don't say that. And then it's like, okay, it's done and you learn. And that's really the only way to get like true sort of diversity education, I guess you could say. Like the diversity training is kind of like, it's a poor substitute almost, but like definitely I still understand the benefits for it. And definitely think that people would benefit if they do certain things, but I don't know. Yeah, we came on here to talk about the documentary and we didn't even really talk about it. So let's talk about it. So it starts off right after the Civil War. It talks about Reconstruction and then into like late 1890s, early 1900s. One of the things that really stood out to me was like Lincoln's plan for, so a lot of the things that politicians in the Republican Party did, to me at least, they were still playing the political sort of game, so to speak. They're like, hey, like black people should be free, but we're going to let the Southern Democrats have this one point. And the thing that didn't make any sense to me is like we were talking about earlier, if it was treason, they would get capital punishment. So why didn't that happen? And that's one thing that the documentary didn't really go into much. And I don't really understand why it worked out the way it did, because you would think that, so for the 12 years of Reconstruction, none of those people were allowed back into power. But then there was a political, 1877, Grant was out of office. Who was elected 1877?
I think it wasn't a Grant.
Grant was like,
he was just the executive. He couldn't get into.
I'm going to Google this. But
I do know right after, I think it was after the Freedmen's Bureau ended, or if it was right after, or right when Reconstruction began, it was like the same military generals and officials pretty much got seats and powers in the states that they represented.
They did. And I didn't understand why that happened. Oh, Rutherford. So Grant left in 1877 and Rutherford B. Hayes was elected. And I believe he was See, this is what I don't understand. So it's Wikipedia, but
Someone's changed
the second sentence down says a lawyer and staunch abolitionist. He defended refugee slaves in court for years. So that's another thing that doesn't make any sense. Why it ended like that? Was it because they lost did they lose the majority in the House or something like that?
I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and watch it specifically. But kind of to the tune of what you said, where some years go by and people forget what happened. Either the people were campaigning on certain promises, or that, they just garnered enough forgiveness from the people they represented back home, and they said, we'll give them a second shot, and then put them essentially back in power. My issue with that is simply the fact that they got back in power, period.
That was the thing. I know it never made sense to me how they got back in power from the standpoint of like this country or like these states just tried to commit treason and you didn't put them in jail. You let them go home
and gave them the land back.
Gave them the land back, and then we're like, yeah, you keep just doing things as you were, no problem. You just can't own slaves. So they're like, oh, we know what you mean. We won't own slaves. Yeah. And it's like,
no jobs. The only job you can have is working on the same plantation you just were a slave on.
Yeah. How that happened is probably one of the biggest blunders I would say in U.S. history.
And think about that, kind of set up the system of just kind of, okay, cool, y'all pardoned us, y'all forgave us for that. What else can we keep doing that y'all forgive us for? Mm-hmm. Where can we keep, pushing up to the line of, okay, what can we do without getting in trouble? The creation of the KKK and everything that they did. They literally, honestly, they broke the law plenty of times, but in society's view and in government's view, they kind of played the terms of the line so often because of the people who were involved. And then just so many people just turned just turned the other cheek to it. They just said, "What? They're not messing with me." It's black people anyways. That's the perspective I can see people back then thinking of. They're just black folk. There's no.
Yeah. What was interesting though is, so when Andrew Johnson gets into office after Lincoln is assassinated, and he goes super soft on the southern states, right? Kind of lets them get back in. Mm-hmm. One of the things the documentary said was like he had this like complex where he was a Southern Democrat, but kind of couldn't not. Couldn't get anywhere. And so like he was like, I'll give you all pardons if you come to me and beg for it, basically. Like he had this weird like personality complex, and like that's what kicked it off. And the weird thing was about that was that happened, but I think the Senate had enough majority to like overrule and veto everything that he was doing. And so the Senate went hard on the southern states at the same time that Johnson was going soft. Yeah. And so it looked like once Johnson was out of office, because he didn't get reelected, once Grant was back in, it looked like things were going well, and they were up until 1877, and then they lost the majority because the states in the South started running like the propaganda stuff, and the KKK was founded, and all that stuff started happening, and it was just like the government decided like, yeah, we don't want to put our troops down there anymore, and like they just stopped, and then everything that had been fought for those 12 years just like went out the window.
Yep.
And that's so like when you
think about it, I'll try and kind of compare it to a modern day thing. The issue is they didn't see it as important enough to keep funding each year. The consensus of the legislators was, what, this just really isn't benefiting us to keep pouring this many millions, or I think it was millions back in that day, dollars into this. We're just gonna pull its funding. Look at modern terms for that same thing. Look at healthcare nowadays. Look at the DACA students, but the DACA kids.
Oh, the Dreamers, yeah.
The Dreamers, like the idea that we no longer want to continue funding this. So you pull the plug, and it literally kind of just collapses a system that was then built upon, that has been built. Mm-hmm. To be able to support the immigrant children who are in this country was supported through Dreamers. You pull the plug on that, now they're in free fall of almost, well, do I get to stay here or does this happen? I think it's literally almost a mirror, not a one-to-one mirror, like I said. It doesn't
It's similar enough to make the comparison.
make the comparison. So it's like this really isn't nothing. That's one thing with America is nothing's new under the sun, especially here in this country. If it's been done today, it's probably been done before in history, where financial interests oversee the idea of actually trying to make sure that these people get reinstated into a country they help build, the success that they help build. We don't see it as important enough to fund making sure you guys get back in. So we're just not gonna fund it.
Yeah,
That kind of opens the floodgates for everything else that you see continue moving forward.
it's a thing that it's like a far or like long-term vision sort of solution that when you are, it's one of the issues, right? Because I think most people are in favor of term limits for Congress people, but at the same time, when you're in Congress for 4 years or 6 years in the Senate and you need to get reelected, you're not looking at a solution like that for a long-term societal solution. You're looking at the solution that'll get you reelected.
There's a whole study on that about the number one interest of, especially Congress, because I think every 2 years, as soon as they get in, they're immediately thinking about reelection.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, so like the term
There's
limits,
track record.
the term limits, what it'll do, aside from the fact that it will stop people from being career politicians, is after like 2 terms, you can't be thinking about reelection anymore. So you have to be thinking about the long term, like sort of set up. Like you would need to set up your person, like whoever's gonna in your party is gonna be next, with the best chance to win by doing like you would think would be smart long term things. Because if you don't, and you set up your successor for failure, like they're not going to get elected. And then the way that the party system is run, it's like, well, that's not good because then you did your party a disservice. But it's weird because it's like, I don't know, like they really dropped the ball. But it's like I almost like you have to lay blame there, but at the same time, based on the situation that they were in, like if you're in 1876, right, and you're like, wow, we've come this far in these 10 years, like maybe we can pull the plug now, like it'll be okay. It's like,
I will say,
like, how would you know? You wouldn't know, like especially if you're not living in those southern states, like you don't
know what's going on.
Like you have no idea. And because there's no internet or anything like that, you're like, wow, we've come this far in 10 years. Like, I think we can pull the funding now and put it somewhere else. It's like, I feel like that would be a reasonable thing for somebody to think then.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of been a shortcoming of our country since then, as you could say, is the short-term memory loss, quote unquote, in the political perspective of, we'll do things that previous politicians, previous presidents, previous people in government have said we shouldn't do this, or this doesn't turn out when we tried it before, so let's be cautious again. And I can only really kind of make that comparison to DACA now with this, but I don't know, there was nothing really beforehand because this is the first time that they've tried to do something like Reconstruction. But just the idea that something will happen and within a decade, let's say a decade or two, people just completely forget about it. I forget which president. I think it was Eisenhower. I want to say it was Eisenhower. I could be incorrect. It was in that era who said
Military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Eisenhower. Yeah.
Yeah. And here we are. What 30? Not 30. Like 70
years. He was president in the 50s.
Like 50s. Yeah, in the 50s. I was gonna say 3 generations, but I was like, okay, it might be 2 generations. But here we are today, and that is the precipice of what our economy is based off of. Is we sell military equipment around the world for our money, essentially. And that kind of does put us into a position where we kind of have to continue. It's funny because I had done a research report on Syria and how some of the terrorist groups out there, the reasons the civil war went on so long is because
we funded them.
We benefited, but there were also I don't even call them companies, like they were just like terrorist groups that benefited off of all of the violence and the chaos because they would get the arms, mostly either from Russia or from us, from stolen goods. They would sell that equipment and then continue to fund all of the stuff that went on. So it's like when that type of environment and war zones are alive and active, there's a profit that can be made from
Yep.
making sure it continues. You give one side bombs, they blow something up. You give another side bigger bombs, they attack. And it's just, you can benefit off of playing both sides of the coin. History has seen that. America's history has seen
we did that in Afghanistan in the 1980s when Russia was there. We funded the Taliban, and we gave them weapons, and then they turned around and then we were fighting them like 15 years later. It's weird. It's like short-sighted versus long-sighted. It's like in 1989 or like the late 1980s when Russia was in Afghanistan, like it seems like the smart thing to do to give the people that are fighting against the Soviets help. Like
through the Cold War lens.
Yeah, it's like
everywhere.
It seems like it's the right thing to do, and then you turn around, like hindsight's always 20/20, right? And it's so easy for us to be like, oh, that was a horrible decision.
Yeah.
But like at the time, it's like not an easy decision at all. Like there's so like, I think some economists, I think maybe it was Thomas Sowell, was like, there's no solution. There's just no solutions. There's only trade-offs or something like that. It's like one of those things. Like history is not kind generally, because we can always look back and be like, well, that was a dumb decision. It's like, but going back to Reconstruction, one of the things that never gets taught is that thing in, first the New Orleans and Memphis massacres, but then the thing in Wilmington. And the thing in Wilmington was particularly alarming because there was no federal government response to that. And that would be something where I would, like, as I've been going on and on about government being out of people's business, that is one thing why they should absolutely have stepped in, and they didn't. So basically, to summarize it for those listening, there was basically after Reconstruction, and most of the Black people who had been in Senate or like their local House of Representatives or whatever had been kind of removed, but in Wilmington they were still there, and so this white elite population sort of decided that enough was enough, and they went and basically just killed all the Black people that had any sort of influence, and then they put it in the newspapers like they did this heroic thing, and then nobody did anything about it.
Called it a race riot.
Yeah, they called it like a race riot or something that it clearly wasn't. And what you said, I don't know if we had started recording yet, but you said it was basically the only coup d'etat in successful coup d'etat on U.S. soil that was like in history, and nobody did anything about it. That was one of the things that I was shocked by, because I hadn't learned about that, and I was just, I remember listening to it and I was like, for real? This, like, and then I was shocked from the standpoint of like, I had never heard about that before. Not so much like that it was allowed to happen because of Jim Crow and all the rest, but like that seems like a fairly big event. And I had never heard of it at all. And like, for me, that's a little bit, obviously I don't know everything about American history, but most big events I've at least heard of, I would think. And so that's why this one particularly, like, I was shocked and then I was pissed. I don't know, like, I don't remember some of the background around it. But yeah, if you want to jump in with.
I can see why you say it doesn't necessarily shock you, because you can see stuff with like Tulsa in Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, and then in California, where it's like, that's really nothing new. Most of the time it's like white people just get fed up with seeing, and then in both of these, actually all three technically, but I'm specifically speaking for the idea of Black Wall Street, and this is, on the political side, you still have control. We don't like it, we'll kill you and take it back. On the financial side, and where they tried to create a whole sustainable society, a sustainable community where we are not dependent upon going into a restaurant where we can't be served. And it's the weirdest thing where it's like they actually did it. Most places try and it's either falls or unsuccessfully, but they did it in Tulsa, and it all got like destroyed, like burned to the ground. Not just, oh, we'll take over. No, we're getting rid of this. You can't have it. We're not gonna have it. It's gone. And I think that was in like 1921. So that actually, I think, was a little later.
Yeah, it was a little later.
Yeah, but just the idea that things like that are permissible, you know, and that wasn't the federal government. It was people who just happened to live either in that same county or community or in surrounding counties. It just say, you know what, we don't want this to continue happening, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. No federal government response, no state government response. In Tulsa, a lot of those pictures got put on postcards, you know, like, hey, this just happened. We ran all the black people out of town. Funny, like.
Yeah, and they were proud of it. They would say like, "Oh, we did like we saved the town or whatever."
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It was just.
It's difficult because you hear all these stories told about the country of, you know, leading in all of these things, and we're the international democracy for all of these other countries, where it's like we've got our own skeletons in the closet that we've tried to put so much other clothes in front of us, if like they're not still there. And I think having those like we can't actually get to be the country that we were envisioned to be without really discussing what we've been through. But I think that's kind of characteristic of the country, is just not talk about it. You know, we're even up until 2020, we're still trying to figure out things that had happened 100 some years ago or even longer that have just not been talked about. You know, even within our lifetime, there's probably going to be some type of, like, even with our like this whole administration now, I don't even want to think about what kind of nonsense we hear that happened moving forward in these couple of years. Someone finally breaks the silence saying, yeah, man, we did all of this stuff these past, you know, these first 2 years of his administration. You know, like everything about the country has just been kind of all image. We are this, we are that. Don't worry about what we did. Don't worry about who we actually are. We're this, that. You know, we're going to stand. You can't be authentic. You can't be the country that founders tried to actually envision this country to be, unless you really talk about the issues that people care about.
That and just
I think
that, and it goes back to education, like we were talking about at the beginning. It's like you have to teach people what actually happened, and then it's like we get back to, well, who defines what gets taught, and then that's a whole nother situation. I feel like this is probably a good place to wrap it up. I think it's been like an hour 45 minutes, man.
Yeah.
It's been crazy. But
we'd have like dinner and just chat. We could sit there for like 3 hours.
Yeah, for sure. We would sit there for 3 hours. But like we said, we'll put the link to the documentary in the description. Yeah, it was great.
You have time. It's 4 hours. It's 4 parts. I would 11 out of 10 recommend watching it.
Yeah, 100%.
And any type of thorough gathering of information about, for one, a period. And I've said, because I learned a lot. I did not learn about any of those stuff in high school. So it's a thorough gathering of knowledge about a period that literally just gets glossed over. I know the name, couldn't tell you anything about what happened before I watched this documentary.
Definitely, like you said, definitely go watch it. And we will see everybody next time. Bye, everybody.
Peace out.